Good to see so many have escaped from the summer outside and is joining this seminar. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar about the humanitarian system and how we need to change the way we work to meet new and pressing challenges. We have a strong list of speakers representing different roles and perspectives, and we hope that by the end of this seminar in 2 hours, we will leave with both concrete suggestions for and examples of how the humanitarian system can provide better for people in critical need of help. My name is Line Hegna. I'm Director of Advocacy and Communication in Save the Children, and I will take us through this seminar. And with us as co-organizers of this event, we're very happy to have PRIO and the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies. It is a fact that while humanitarian response has developed a lot over several decades and saved the lives of millions of people, we are facing serious challenges. The current humanitarian system is in crisis, not adapting fast enough or changing radically enough. And it fails to deliver to help all those people who are currently suffering from the impacts of conflict, of natural disaster, or both. The people we aim to help just don't think we're doing a good job, ODA argues in their report, Time to Let Go. And how we face this challenge and how and what we do to untangle the web of good intentions that we all have that currently does not result in alleviation of suffering in the scale that it should will be judged by history. It is a challenging task, but it is not impossible. We have strong faith in people's creativity and skills to reform and the potential for innovation, not least, both within and outside the system. Bridging the gap is the metaphor we've used for a long time, trying to illustrate what we need to do differently in situations that exceeds the old order of the divide between development and humanitarian. This seminar is called Humanitarian Point Break, and I think this shows that in spite of the dire situation, we are optimistic. The metaphor, for those not familiar with it, is borrowed from the surf world. It refers to any break formed when waves hit a rock or formation of land jutting out from the coastline. This generally forms a nice peeling wave that is very surfable, the perfect wave. I will soon give the floor to our main speaker, whose introduction will be followed by comments from our co-organizers in PRIO and the State Secretary, before we invite 4 Norwegian humanitarian actors to reflect on how we are prepared to contribute to the humanitarian revolution. We will then open up for 2 more comments from the floor before we ask the State Secretary to respond to what has been said, and finally closing remarks from Christina Bennett. And without further ado, it is a great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Christina Bennett. I think for anyone concerned with today's topic, she is a well-known, strong and constructive voice, and she probably does not need further introduction, but let me still say that she is a research fellow at Overseas Development Institute and an international aid policy analyst with extensive experience working for the UN and several international policy institutes on humanitarian, conflict and post-conflict peace-building policy. She was also instrumental in developing the concept for the World Humanitarian Summit, which was just held in Istanbul. And she has written a key reference report in this discourse with the telling title, Time to Let Go, Remaking Humanitarian Action for the Modern Era, which I believe is circulated in the room. And it's a report that in many ways inspired us to have this seminar. So Christina, we look forward to hearing your analysis and challenges to us for a new humanitarian system.
Thank you very much, Lena, and thank all of you for inviting me here today. For us, for me as a former UN staff member and now at ODI, Norway and Norwegian organizations have always been at the forefront of the support and progressive thinking of humanitarian action. So I feel a great privilege being able to stand here today and share with you our report and the results of our research. So thank you very much. I don't know about all of you, but the long-awaited World Humanitarian Summit left me a bit conflicted. After 2 years of consultation, of hand-wringing, of policy papers, all the hard work, were all of those achievements worth the effort? Did it all set us on a new path for more effective humanitarian action? Were the people living in crisis served? Did it create that perfect wave, that point break that Lena just referred to a moment ago? Without understanding all of the details resulting from the 1,500-odd commitments that came out of the summit, I would feel that the picture coming out of Istanbul is a bit mixed. Certainly there were some important announcements made. Donors actually sought to raise the ceiling of the Central Emergency Response Fund from $500 million to $1 billion, which is significant. The Grand Bargain committed or lightly committed organizations to increase the use of cash to try to fund local organizations more directly, to fund more flexibly and for longer term in exchange for more transparency in how that money is applied. New announcements of new initiatives, such as a fund for education in emergencies, new networks of regional organizations, philanthropists, private sector groups, and Southern NGOs, a new financial instrument, such as an Islamic endowment fund, are all fledgling initiatives, but important ones to watch. But for us at HPG, and based on 4 years of our research on the changing humanitarian landscape, these commitments, these initiatives will not gain traction unless more fundamental changes take place. And this is something that the summit failed to do. Our research and our current thinking reflects a growing sense that the traditional humanitarian sector is on the cusp of a decisive moment in its history. That for 75 years, the stalwarts of humanitarian assistance, the UN agencies, the Red Cross system, the international NGOs have seen themselves as indispensable players at the heart of the way that humanitarian assistance is implemented and as the arbiters of the norms and conduct of how that system is provided, of how that assistance is provided. But what has become increasingly plain to us during the course of our research was that this centrality was not, if not an illusion, was only part of the picture of how the reality of the global humanitarian assistance today. The members of the formal humanitarian system are by no means redundant. The billions of dollars still being channeled through them are a testament to that. But they are just one part of a broader universe of assistance made up of myriad other actors that have their own traditions and their own cultures of care. This lies at the very heart of what we have called in our report, Time to Let Go, Humanitarian Action's Crisis of Legitimacy. That despite a decade of reforms, the sector is still falling short in the world's most enduring crises. That despite a commitment to accountability to affected populations, it is not doing a good job in the eyes of the people it aims to serve. According to research from Ground Truth, only 1 in 6 people surveyed in the aftermath of the Nepal earthquake, and 1 in 16 during the early stages of the Ebola response, felt that their most important needs were being met. Attempts at reform have been focused on improving the system that is already in place, rather than tackling more fundamental issues of power, incentives, architecture, and engaging with the political economy of the system itself. Initiatives such as the Humanitarian Response Review, the Transformative Agenda, have all been technical exercises amounting to rearranging the deck chairs instead of the construction of a more seaworthy ship that's better able to navigate the challenges of today's crises. And despite all of the discussions about the need for change in the lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit, tackling these internal problems was largely off the agenda. So what has changed, and why the need for change? Well, for one, the conduct of war and the nature of disasters looks very different today than it did in 1945, when the formal humanitarian system came of age. And indeed in the 1990s, when many of the institutions that we work with today took shape. Disasters are more intense, they're more costly, conflicts are overwhelmingly internal versus international, fought through new forms of warfare and with non-state actors. Transnational interests and groups are superseding state sovereignty and authority, leading increasingly to a dismantling of the nation state as a reference point for our engagement. Urban violence is on the rise, and global long-term displacement is one of the largest challenges of our time. Crises last longer, and those distinctions between emergency response and development are no longer relevant in many cases. There has also been a massive change in who is funding, organizing, and delivering humanitarian aid. The rise of donors like China, Turkey, and the Gulf states is less about them being new. It's more about how we are becoming more aware of their importance. As you see from this slide, regional organizations are becoming more prominent humanitarian players. The private sector is and has long been a major contributor to humanitarian action. In the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, experts indicated that the private sector contributed at least half of assistance to that emergency. Remittances from diaspora groups all over the world are more consistent and reliable than ODA or foreign direct investment. All of this is significantly shifting the relationship between aid givers and aid recipients, and should be changing the way that we work. But it hasn't. Why is that? Well, for one, money and power concentrated at the center form an oligopoly of a limited number of donors and a limited number of recipients that drive a preoccupation with growth and market share, create powerful disincentives for ceding resources and control to other organizations that might serve as competition for funding and visibility. And it limits downward accountability to affected populations. Accountability exists between donors and the organizations that they fund. As a result, engagement with national organizations is often an afterthought, and engagement with local and national NGOs is largely transactional. The cultural, procedural, and linguistic barriers for more strategic and constructive engagement are high. And this plays out in places like Syria, when donors lost valuable time in the search for partners that met their strict criteria, instead of adapting to the context and being more flexible in their approach. This is not to say that we should always assume that a more local response is always better. There will be situations where this is not the case at all. There simply needs to be a more honest and realistic assessment about the strengths and limitations of different types of responders, and a more explicit recognition of the complexities that engagement among them entails. There is also an enduring cultural paternalism that puts local solutions as inferior to international ones and assumes that those operating outside the formal system want to join it. On their part, these rising humanitarian donors and aid organizations are not at all interested in supplementing our system and are developing their own approaches that they feel are more trustworthy and legitimate. This was the case during the Ebola response in West Africa and is certainly now the case in places like Syria and Yemen. They challenge the universality of humanitarian principles and mechanisms as vectors of Western values and intervention. And even inside the sector, humanitarian principles have become a barrier to change, dividing humanitarians between those who insist on neutral, independent, and impartial aid, and those who accept a wider interpretation of their life-saving remit that includes addressing the causes of conflict as well as conflict's effects. In reality, the majority of organizations engaged in humanitarian assistance combine their emergency work with development, human rights, and conflict resolution work. They're also concerned with political and societal change. even as they define their crisis-affected work in crisis-affected areas with reference to humanitarian principles. Picking and choosing when and which humanitarian principles apply by claiming to be abiding by all of them undermines their overall utility, reinforces the perception that humanitarian assistance is operating to a double standard, and undermines trust in the aid endeavor overall. This humanitarian exceptionalism serves to sideline those outside the system who may not subscribe to all of the principles or who seek to adapt them to their own terms. And in doing so, we overlook the capacity, the funds, the expertise, the know-how that these organizations can bring. These who might not be principled humanitarian actors in the strict sense, but may be better placed to help. It is our view that to remain effective and relevant, the humanitarian sector must regain its legitimacy for itself, vis-a-vis these new and emerging actors, and in the eyes of the people it claims to serve. To do this, it must abandon the structures, the behaviors, the culture that is currently holding it back. In short, it's time to let go. And we need to let go in 3 key ways. First, the formal humanitarian system needs to let go of power and control, shifting its focus from one of supply to one of support. The question it should be asking every time it moves into a crisis response mode is not, what can I give, but what can I do to help? This requires a more diversified and devolved operating model that cedes power and resources to those currently at the margins of humanitarian assistance, and involves a commitment by the system's main players to make difficult choices in the way they operate. As a start, UN agencies and large international NGOs should shift their priorities away from direct implementation to become enablers of others in crisis response, through investment in their capacity and through direct financing of their operations. Donors need to support this in this shift. Second, the humanitarian system must let go of the perverse incentives that work against evolution and change, that drive destructive competition among humanitarian organizations. It must redefine success so that the needs of people affected by crisis trump the needs of organizations in terms of greater resources and visibility. This requires a major shift in the behaviors and financial incentives of the system's core donors, to reduce the barriers to funding local or NGOs directly, and to promote collective outcomes by rewarding organizations that are able to work collaboratively with them and among themselves. They need to take calculated risks and translate lessons learned into policies and practice. Third, as crises last longer and straddle conflicts, disasters, and endemic poverty, humanitarians need to let go of that exceptionalism, of those artificial divides that hold the sector back, and become more realistic, more honest, and more ethical in the way it responds to people's needs. More realistic in the sense that humanitarian organizations need to dial back the expectations of what humanitarian activities and funds can do, and work more closely with development organizations when longer-term approaches are needed. Honest in the use of the humanitarian label, applying it to a more classic form of humanitarian action undertaken by those specialized agencies that can actually uphold the principles in practice. And ethical, in the sense that humanitarian organizations should let go of the idea that only card-carrying humanitarians can provide effective relief, and accept that different forms of assistance are legitimate and can coexist. This will enable capable responders, whether governmental, local, or international, to work more cohesively and collectively together. This all requires a seismic shift in the culture under which the system currently operates, moving away from unmitigated expansion and competition toward greater levels of complementarity, cooperation, and trust. Now, I know we have a mix of government representatives, practitioners, and academics here today, so I wanted to pose some questions for you to think about as I speak, but also during the course of the discussion we have this afternoon, in the context of what I've just said, and also in the context of where you sit within this sector. In your mind, what role should the formal humanitarian system play in emergency response? How might this differ across different emergency contexts? If you work for an operational organization, what does this shift mean for your fieldcraft, for your technical expertise, for your presence and partnerships? What is your role as international organizations to help donors channel funds directly to local organizations and to enable those local organizations to receive those funds and to use them to good effect? If you are a government official or a donor of humanitarian assistance, how to sell the idea of local humanitarian action to your constituencies, and how to reorient the financial incentives to organizations from direct service delivery and toward enabling of local organizations. Can this be done as a matter of good humanitarian donorship, or is this something that needs to be done on an individual basis? Are the humanitarian principles universal, or are they vectors of Western bias? Are they necessary foundations for emergency response, or do they perpetuate artificial divides within organizations and vis-a-vis others outside the system? How can we reconcile the need the need to be principled with the need to find partnership with others? These are very hard questions and very large issues. And this meeting, our report, the World Humanitarian Summit, will not be able to provide complete answers. But what I do hope is that such discussions contribute to a fuller debate on the future direction of humanitarian policy and practice, and sustain the momentum, the ambition for change that the WHS actually did set in motion. Effectively addressing needs, not ideology, should dictate our response to crisis. And mindset reform, more than mandate reform, must be where such change begins. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. I think in terms of partnership, we are better and have a lot to learn from how we work in development and in terms of innovation. I think there is a lot of potential there, which we might also look more into in the course of this seminar. The next speaker is Kristin Bergtora Sandvik. Sandvik is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute Oslo and coordinator for the Humanitarianism Research Group there. On this morning, on the TV morning show, Good Morning Norway, today you said that the frank discussion among humanitarian actors exists now on the flaws of the current system and what needs to change, even if it challenges our position. And that shows, at least, I think, that there is recognition of the problem and a will to change. So, Kristin, we are looking forward to hearing your perspective on the current challenges for the formal humanitarian system. Please.
So that mention of breakfast TV also explains why I partly look like a Stepford wife here. They put a lot of makeup on you. So thank you for this introduction, and thank you to Save the Children for inviting us to co-organize this event, and thank you all for coming. As academics, I just want to express my appreciation that the Norwegian humanitarian community is really very full of intellectually curious individuals, and all of the organizations have been very interested in coordinating and co-hosting events with the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies, and I hope this will continue. Because I do believe that debates like this is part of the work towards humanitarian accountability, both towards crisis-affected communities, but also towards the taxpayer. We need to discuss issues, and we need to discuss issues that are difficult and uncomfortable, and in particular, with Norway's status as a humanitarian superpower, much more critical scrutiny needs to be given to Norwegian humanitarian donorship as well. I obviously agree with everything Christina said, but I'll sum up my viewpoints in kind of 3 basic points. I know I probably have 9 minutes left. I think it's pretty obvious that the humanitarian sector has become too large. There is an enormous growth happening as we speak. Humanitarians keep complaining about lack of humanitarian access, but as a sector, you guys, there have never been more people, you have never done more things in more places, right? So hearing you out on complaints about limited humanitarian access, it sounds a little difficult. I think the grand bargain is a really fair attempt to tackle a systemic problem, that the international humanitarian community eats a disproportionate part of the cake. But one thing is to recognize this and to actually say it and to start, thinking about numbers that need to be redistributed. Something else is to see this actually happen. And for that to happen, local actors, they need to get more funding, more resources, but also a larger percentage of the overall cake, right? And this is going to hurt. This means that there will be fewer jobs for international humanitarian actors, workers, in the field and in their country offices. And I hope that donors like Norway will contribute to put pressure on this. I mean, organizations need to downsize, to use less resources, and to be more cost effective. And of course, in particular, this pertains to certain UN agencies. I think we have moved somewhat towards having an engaged and critical conversation about involvement of the private sector. Part of the humanitarian community is very enthralled to technology and the business sector. But I think, and the other half has been sort of allergic. And I think we're now kind of meeting in the middle and actually having, realistic conversations about how this can happen. At the same time, we obviously see that some of the old humanitarian problems are alive and well. We struggle to coordinate in the field. We struggle not to compete. There are problems of sufficiently professional attitudes to humanitarian work. There are problems of accountability, and that remain, unfortunately, endemic to the larger system. So, please keep working harder on this. However, no matter how well humanitarians do their work, and I think many organizations have dramatically improved the quality of their work over the last decade. No matter how well humanitarians do their work, it's ultimately political, right? Today we see a quite worrisome trend to humanitarianize political issues, right? So instead of having political discussions about solutions, we end up doing what we're doing here today, namely discussing various technical solutions to improving a system, when the real solution to the problems are outside the humanitarian field. The third, or the last sort of note I have on this, how we perceive the contemporary challenges, it's the whole business of the power definitions and the politics of numbers, which is something, as an academic, I'm more or less required to say. You keep talking about unprecedented levels of crisis, of an increasing funding gap, that you're underfunded, and there's a protection gap, and so on and so forth, right? But you get to define, what would be enough funding, right? What does enough look like for you? And also, the humanitarian sector has seen radical mission creep. The more activities you define as humanitarian, the more areas you think that you are entitled to intervene in. I mean, look at urban violence. Look at what's going on with urban violence in Latin America at the moment. The more you assume that your toolbox is the appropriate and correct one for a certain social and human problem, obviously the larger the gap you're going to see, right? And this relates to this assumption that, as humanitarians, you're welcome. And then it's the second issue that I'll talk briefly about, is the notion of exceptionalism. I think Christina is really, actually, it's a brilliant part of the report. The report is very good, but this one I liked particularly. The idea about being more honest, but also more limited in claims about what humanitarianism can do, and when this is the appropriate response. I tend to think, personally, that the current version of the humanitarian development nexus, that the bridging of this nexus is affected by a host of sort of underlying motivations related to security politics, for example, related to the desire to stop global migration, to use aid funding for, making people stay put instead of moving as a strategy of self-protection. So I'm skeptical to some of the conversation happening around the need to bridge that nexus. And I do think that there are certain components of the humanitarian response, neutrality, for example, impartiality, helping according to need, that is truly valuable. what I do see as a concern is, this humanitarian mission creep, right? When you take these values and you enter a new field, what happens to the larger picture, right? What happens to ideas about social justice, about redistribution, about local government, about participation, about political processes? Humanitarians are very eager at talking about how nobody else is entitled to intrude on their humanitarian space, because then they will destroy and contaminate. Humanitarians are much less clear about how they themselves will transform themselves into effective actors by staying put. And I think it's time for some soul searching in terms of what you're actually able to do. At some point, it's time to, pack up and leave. Long-term emergency aid, I don't really like that title. And I'm running out of time, so my last comments are for Norwegian humanitarian donorship. Over the last couple of weeks, many of us have attended events with the Norwegian Refugee Council and the NORAD, who hosted this event on the Syria evaluation. And so 3 issues of general interest stand out to my mind from these events. I think it's a real paradox that Norway is a fairly eager support of military intervention. The threshold for the use of force has gone down radically the last 15 years. And many of the crises we see now are the result of Western military engagements. I am sorry to say that I think the Norwegian humanitarian community, we haven't been loud enough in vocalizing critiques of this, right? As a donor, Norway gets a lot of praise from the international community, and obviously is a very generous donor and helps out a lot of very important initiatives. But I think it's time to sort of be more articulate in resistance to the use of force and kind of those war against terror, war on terror projects. Secondly, humanitarian access will get more difficult when humanitarian aid is instrumentalized in the fight against actors like Daesh, for example. I watched you talk to Egeland a couple of weeks ago when he was insisting that, when you list development aid, political action, humanitarian aid, when you put these in the same basket and use these as a strategy to, fight ISIS, this is really destroying the chance for humanitarian access. And finally, I think we should, be concerned about this almost ritual thing we're going through at the moment, where we have evaluations of Norwegian funding of humanitarian crisis responses like Haiti or Syria, and apparently now with Afghanistan. And we really say, oh, we need to learn. We haven't learned. Why are we making the same mistakes over and over again? And then we hear ourselves, come with the same critical comments over and over again. But I do think that as a community, we need to sort of work together on this. We are all, to some degree, accountable for the use of this funding and need to take evaluation seriously. So I think that was basically it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin, for very valuable challenges, both to us as humanitarian organizations, but also to the State Secretary as a donor. And I hope we will, throughout the seminar, maybe also come with some suggestions and try to respond to some of those challenges. So our next speaker is State Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Tore Hattrem. We're very glad to have you with us today. You are the State Secretary responsible for humanitarian affairs and with an important experience yourself from working in humanitarian contexts, as, for example, the ambassador in Afghanistan. And you have seen at close range humanitarian assistance at its best and its worst. And we've asked you to comment on how the Norwegian government will respond to these challenges and contribute to the change needed. So please.
Guess I gotta adjust a little bit taller than you, both of you, I'm afraid. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. And I should start by actually thanking PRIO and Save the Children and also NCHS for organizing this seminar. And then I will really give a big hug to both Christina and Kristin for very refreshing and thought-provoking ideas. And I shouldn't say ideas because these are really research-based findings which we will really look into. So thank you for that presentation and your comments. And I guess that we will continue later in the debate when we have questions, comments. I will also have a chance to comment some more, well thought over reflections on your findings and your comments. But first, let me speak a little bit about us, the Norwegian government. Again, pleasure to be here to offer some thoughts on humanitarian action and priorities for Norway. As already mentioned, the humanitarian system is under tremendous pressure, as highlighted by previous speakers. The gap between global humanitarian needs and resources to meet them is widening at an alarming rate. I know that there are discussions and debates about this, but we can come back to that. And we will continue to focus on this together with Red Barna and other partners. Related to this, strengthening the compliance with international humanitarian law is and will remain a core issue for Norway. In the lead-up to the summit, Norway supported the joint statement on international humanitarian law. The importance of the humanitarian principles, essential in our view to providing access to affected populations and protection for aid workers, was reiterated by Norway and others during the summit. Fourth priority, increased and more efficient humanitarian assistance. This year, Norway has increased its humanitarian budget by more than 30% compared to 2015. We have also significantly increased our support for the Syrian refugee crisis with a record high 4-year pledge of 10 billion Norwegian crowns announced at the London conference in February. And we continue to give high priority to following up the Supporting Syria conference. Foreign Minister Brende co-hosted a follow-up meeting on this issue in Istanbul. The crisis in Syria has shown us the need for bridging the gap between development actors and humanitarian actors, between immediate relief and long-term development, which was a central aspect in what Christina and Kristin talked about. In the neighboring countries like Jordan and Lebanon, it is crucial to have a close collaboration and coordination between these different actors in order to give the best possible assistance to the Syrian refugees and the vulnerable in the host communities. In addition to providing high levels of financial support, we are committed to providing quality funding. We agree with the high-level panel on humanitarian financing that closing the funding gap is not simply about asking donors to give more, but also to give better. And this requires us all to innovate and to rethink some of our approaches to more efficiently serve people in need. We support the so-called Grand Bargain that was launched in Istanbul. The goal is to contribute to reducing the funding gap through more efficiencies and innovation, such as through a scale-up of cash-based programming. Norway is already doing much of what the Grand Bargain recommends. For example, flexible core support, multi-year funding agreements with several strategic partners, and simplified reporting requirements. Let me now turn to the outcomes of the summit and next steps. The summit contributed to putting many of the most pressing challenges on the global radar. It also went some way in creating broader ownership of the humanitarian agenda. One of the most important outcomes was the strong recognition of the need to work differently in protracted crisis and to do more to bridge the gap between humanitarian assistance and long-term development. I was particularly encouraged to see the active engagement of the multilateral development banks and their recognition of the need to engage earlier, take more risks, and explore innovative financing mechanisms. We need to work more collaboratively across institutional boundaries, while at the same time respecting the primacy of the humanitarian principles. Our success will be measured on how we meet the needs of the most vulnerable, the children, people with disabilities, leaving no one behind. Reaching women and girls is a prerequisite for effective humanitarian action. I was also encouraged by the broad support for the new Education Cannot Wait Fund. The summit confirmed that education in crisis is much higher on the humanitarian agenda than previously. Grand Bargain was another concrete deliverable from the summit. It is far from being the only solution to the funding gap, but it is an honest attempt to stretch the available financing and improve delivery in the field to better serve people in need. We are committed to be a strong advocate for inclusive and accountable follow-up. Closing the funding gap will require political will and collective action, above and beyond the Grand Bargain. More efforts are needed to broaden and deepen the resource base, including through new and innovative partnerships. Another important takeaway from the summit was the recognition of the diversity of the humanitarian system and the need to strengthen partnerships with local actors and private sectors, which have been underlined earlier today. These were some of the positive outcomes of the summit. We also need to recognize some of the downsides. A lot of time and resources went into the preparations, but it's not clear how the number of the pledges and commitments will be taken forward. We expect more clarity in the follow-up report of the Secretary General that will be presented in September. Some have also voiced disappointment that the summit did not do more to advance critical issues such as respect for the humanitarian principles and compliance of humanitarian law. Norway was among those that prioritized these issues in Istanbul, and we will continue our efforts in these areas. Others felt that the summit did not sufficiently address issues of UN reform. This was a multi-stakeholder event, and the agenda went far beyond UN system issues. But from our side, we will continue to pursue UN reform in other fora. We will use the process around the next quadrennial comprehensive policy review to see how coordination and cooperation between humanitarian development actors within the UN system can be strengthened. Together with a group of countries, Norway is also working on a list of reform proposals for the next Secretary General as part of the UN 70 project. Forced displacement was an important issue at the summit, and the complexity of the issues calls for a new approach on how to address large population movements. The UN high-level plenary meeting on addressing large population movements in September will be an important opportunity to address one of the most pressing issues of our time. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on how we can strengthen humanitarian action to better serve people in need. Thank you a lot.
Thank you very much, much, State Secretary. I think it's your comments illustrate how there is an important momentum now with the acknowledgement both from important donors and from the humanitarian community itself that it's not only about the size of the support, but we have to give, you have to give better and we have to help better. And those in a position to help better and be more innovative in how we meet people are, among others, the 4 organizations here present. So we will hear from my own organization, Save the Children, as well as the Norwegian Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, and the Norwegian Refugee Council. And we've asked all of you to reflect on how Norwegian NGOs are prepared to contribute to the humanitarian revolution. And we start with the humanitarian director in Save the Children, Gry Ballestad.
Thank you. First of all, I'm very happy to be here and discuss this extremely important issue. And both Christina and Kristin have brought critical perspectives to the table. Every time I have had a performance appraisal with a humanitarian manager, they always say, I never have time to think. And it's really key for us to have the cooperation with you, who really have the time to think, so that we can work together. I'm also glad and very happy to see that the Norwegian government, here represented by Mr. Hattrem, is also engaged in this issue. And as Norwegian NGOs, we have an important role in this debate and also in how we can change. So we heard a lot about the stress in the humanitarian system. And from our perspective in Save the Children, I would like to emphasize the fact that children are bearing the brunt of these challenges that we experience. All over the world, children in crisis and conflict have their basic rights denied, including their right to survival, to be protected, and to learn. And these needs exist within a system that's not completely fit for fight. Crises last for years. Humanitarian responses are designed for months at a time, a year at the best. We're not reaching the most marginalized in countries like Syria, Yemen. Needs are growing, resources are limited, and relatively little is invested in preparedness and resilience. There is not one solution that's going to solve all the challenges we are facing. And the humanitarian system is just one piece in a much bigger picture. There are national governments, there are local actors, there's the private sector, but we have to do what we can to be better at what we do. And what I would like to focus on here are a couple of the issues where I think we as the NGO community really need to walk the talk, where we need to put action behind our words and contribute to change. And I would like to talk about localization. And I would have liked to also talk about how we can bridge the gap between humanitarian and development. Probably not have the time, but in our debate later. First, though, I would like to say, and it's been mentioned here, it's not all bad. We have actually improved, you know? We see that in most conflict and disasters, mortality and malnutrition is down. We see, for example, Ethiopia now. There are lots to be said about that, the drought there, but it could have been a lot worse if we really had not seen a system that was able to step up and that had invested a lot in preparedness. We are better at measuring and documenting our results, and we are much better at coordinating our efforts on the ground. However, this professionalization of the humanitarian business has really also come at a cost. There's not always room for contextual variation, difficult for smaller actors, and local engagement and ownership. There is not a big room for it. International actors frequently deploy to crisis with an inadequate understanding of the national context, including the legal and institutional structures for disaster management. We are guided by international guidelines and procedures that are based on an assumption that international systems will be used with international actors in the lead. This doesn't only represent a lost opportunity to build the capacity, those who will be around the next time a crisis happens, but it can also be a lost opportunity to access the really hard-to-reach communities. I think the conference in London earlier this year on Syria, really the NGOs there represented this view by saying, you know, we are there, we're on the ground, we know the context, we take a lot of risk, but we only get a small fraction of the money. So what can we do? Or as Christina said, how can we play an enabling role? A lot of change is needed. And you know, the world in 30 years is not going to look like it's looking now. There are going to be different donors around the table, and we're not going to have the same big Western-dominated NGOs as we're having now. So now is our chance to step up and let go of some of the power and the funding, looking at local solutions. We need to be more flexible, listen closely to the people we're supposed to help. We need to be local and national capacity to respond to crisis, and we need to put our money where our mouths are. We need to invest in resilience, preparedness, and robust societies. If we are to redirect the humanitarian system to a more localized system, led by national and local actors, we must shift away from the one-size-fits-all systems and procedures towards envisaging a supportive, advisory, and a smaller role for the international community. And finally, such a shift must be accompanied by increased financial support for national and local actors, and it will require an examination of the barriers these actors face in actually accessing international funds. This is not going to happen overnight. It's not like we're all going to throw away our business models and do something different, but it must really be the aim, and this is the way the world is moving. And we risk being sort of left out if we don't follow. You could argue that my points here really relate to contexts where national governments actually wish to provide support to their populations, but have limited capacity to do so. And there are contexts where you have governments that, despite huge humanitarian needs, are not interested or even a party to the conflict. This is where the international humanitarian community must have the capacity to step in, but we should also be quite open about where the solutions are. They are political, and that's where we also need to challenge both our donors and state leaders to step up. But even in these cases, and particularly in protracted crisis, we should be looking for ways to strengthen local mechanisms for risk reduction and social protection. And if we don't, we really risk ignoring the power of local groups and take away their agency and dignity from crisis-affected people. I would like to end my intervention with a challenge to all of us. There are lots of needs in the world today, and we have to be able to deliver more and better. And our options are to consider to work in an to continue working in an imperfect system as we're doing now, or really to do what we can to make it not a perfect system, but at least much better. Thank you.
Thank you, Gry, from an organization with decades of experience as a development organization and a shorter track record as a humanitarian actor. I'll give the floor to International Director in Norwegian Red Cross, Tørris Jæger, from an organization which really lives and breathes the humanitarian system. Please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for holding this. This is interesting, and it's really a lot of food for thought. I wish we would have more time to really go into depth of many of the issues. But let's try to see if I can contribute something meaningful. First, World Humanitarian Summit. My expectations were limited, maybe. I think the World Humanitarian Summit was good. That's a perspective from limited expectations. When it started, we were worried. We were very genuinely worried about the integrity of humanitarian principles being challenged by the World Humanitarian Summit. That did not happen. They were strengthened. That was very important for us. Secondly, we were worried about role of international humanitarian law. We also saw that the importance of humanitarian law was underlined. If the World Humanitarian Summit becomes the turning point that the Secretary General aims for, and the break point or point break that you refer to, will at the end of the day be contingent on better and stronger application and abidance by international humanitarian law. That's the bottom line. I think it went beyond that in the sense that it was not only damage control, it was damage control plus, in the sense that there has been focus on localization of aid, on preparedness, and the grand bargain was achieved. And I think in that sense, the World Humanitarian did something in triggering action, in triggering statements and commitments that would have not happened if the World Humanitarian Summit had not taken place. I think also that some benchmarks have been set that will be very difficult to retract from, also for those who did not attend the World Humanitarian Summit. So we've drawn some lines in the sand, and now it's upon us to see to that they're not being compromised. The World Humanitarian Summit basically, I think, can be summarized in this one phrase: as local as possible, as international as necessary. And I think in the report, this focus on going from supply to support really sums that up very nicely. I think from a Red Cross, Red Crescent perspective, this is what we're aiming to do by building or by strengthening national societies. We've just had this Afghanistan report, so allow me to reflect a little on Afghanistan and the way that it's working there. We have worked for many years through and with the Afghan Red Crescent. There's no Norwegian Red Cross projects in Afghanistan. There's Afghan Red Crescent projects in Afghanistan. Now, for being a relevant humanitarian actor in Afghanistan and in places like Afghanistan, you need presence. Access is contingent on presence, and presence is contingent on acceptance. And to be accepted in remote areas under shifting controls of different types of actors, you need, as simple as that, you need to live by the humanitarian principles. Now, the humanitarian principles derive from the 7 fundamental principles that the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement adopted 61 years ago, it is very clear to us. So any reference to as do the humanitarian principles, are they relevant? Are they a Western concept? No, they're not a Western concept. We have 190 national societies around the globe. If there's one defining element that really combines us all, is a value statement in how we relate to each other. If I meet somebody from Mongolia, from Syria, or from Afghanistan, or from Guatemala, we're united by having those same principles that define the type of action we provide, the niche that we seek, the added value that we want to contribute, and how we're engaging in difficult circumstances. So what we see as our prime role in situations like that is it's the Afghan Red Crescent who has access. We need to enable them to leverage that access. So we have to put our efforts in strengthening their capacities and capabilities in terms of logistics, in terms of procurement, in terms of fleet management, in terms of good programming, in terms of inclusion, in terms of how you best program in terms of focused on marginalized groups, and so on and so on. Leveraging their ability to actually deliver is what makes us relevant. I think what also comes into play here is that we need to look at a division of tasks. Not everything can be localized. If I look at the Red Cross, Red Crescent world, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, has certain obligations, has a mandate. The protection, visits of detainees will only be carried out by expatriates, by delegates. That has a function of neutrality, but it also has a function of protecting those who are actually carrying out the protection activities. Also, we see that in terms of scope and scale, very often we support national societies be it in Syria, be it in Afghanistan, be it around the world, in carrying out action that is community-based, that is complementary to what authorities or those formal or informal authorities in charge can or cannot provide. We have to complement that maybe through then action, for example, by the ICSC. If we look at what they're doing, they try to avoid doing water trucking. They try to provide or maintain water installations, water infrastructure. Go to Syria. What is being done is not handouts of or putting some tap stand somewhere around Aleppo. What is done is maintaining the integrity of the water system as best as possible to provide water for the entirety of the Aleppo population. This is not only how you provide humanitarian assistance neutrally, but it also has a long-term effect because we aim to maintain the resilience of local populations by maintaining the integrity of the infrastructure that is already there, and that has a much more long-term effect than sort of the traditional perspective that we have on humanitarian assistance as providing a tap stand somewhere. In terms of the question of, I like the term fieldcraft. That was brought up. For us, that is important, and we need to, it speaks to very much to the identity of who we are and our staff. Are we the ones who are supplying? Are we the ones who actually are implementing? And do we need sort of world-class experts in that, or do we need people who can enable others? And that is sometimes a good doctor is also a good doctor who can teach others. Often it's not the case. So our focus in terms of who we want to work with us is people who are able to communicate and enable others and who do not see their role as being on the front line, because eventually those who will be on the front line are our volunteers from the national societies that we're working with. And I think I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tørris. We'll then hear from our next speaker, Erwin van Land, representing Doctors Without Borders, or MSF Norway, an organization who chose not to participate in the World Humanitarian Summit. So please let us hear your perspectives on the current challenges.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be here, and thanks also to the previous speakers. I think it's already quite rich in terms of content that is on the table. I'll come back to the World Humanitarian Summit in a moment. I just want to start with sharing with you that I think about 2 weeks ago I did something that I've never done before, which is write a thank you letter to a politician. It doesn't come natural for anyone in MSF, and you won't be surprised to hear that. But knowing the very active role that the Norwegian government, particularly Foreign Affairs, has played behind the scenes on issues of adherence to international humanitarian law, I felt compelled to recognize that. So the letter has gone to the foreign minister. And we're really, really happy that there's this recognition, very strong recognition in the Norwegian government that we lose so much if we lose international humanitarian law. So thanks a lot for that again. But it was a bit of an uncanny experience, obviously. It brings me to another point. I heard that actually when this report, by the way, excellent report, was presented in April, Yves Dacour made quite a snappy comment. And it's hearsay, so I don't know the exact phrasing, but apparently he said, if the humanitarian system is broken, it's primarily because the Security Council is broken. And I think that's a really important remark. I think we run the risk nowadays to confuse the responsibilities of states and interstate organizations with the responsibilities of humanitarian organizations. This was actually one of the key reasons why we decided to give the World Humanitarian Summit a miss. What happened, a lot of internal discussion, we're very good at that in MSF, in the lead up. So first we thought we should go, because we had some really important points to make, of course, there, and we're also interested in what others would have to say. Then we saw the first sort of drafts of the agenda, and we got really disheartened. Agenda that seemed to focus very strongly on putting everything under one and the same umbrella, a very clear definition of what the outcome should be, etc. So then we tended towards maybe we should not go. But then Ban Ki-moon stepped in and came with a very powerful report, setting what I personally and many in MSF were hoping would be the agenda of the World Humanitarian Summit, really addressing key issues when it comes to the humanitarian system, key not only gaps but misconstructs that have grown over time. But also looking indeed at issues around the protection of medical facilities, schools, and other places where you typically find civilians and that should be protected in warfare. So then all of a sudden we thought, yeah, let's go, let's be there. After that, the agenda started growing and our fears came back. This is not the kind of place where MSF should be committing itself to the outcomes. Again, it was mainly around the fact that state actors and humanitarian organizations were sort of put into the same basket with the same level of a shared responsibility to shape the future of the world, etc. Something that we're completely uncomfortable with, as you can imagine. So we didn't go. I agree there have been some interesting outcomes. I think the fact that there was a World Humanitarian Summit to begin with for the first time in history is worth marking. But I hope that if ever there's a second one, the agenda is, at least from our perspective, a bit more focused. The main point that I want to make in the couple of minutes that I have here now is that I don't disagree that there should be the ambition for many parties to work together to tackling some of the fundamental issues that make people suffer to begin with. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, I think they're brilliant, absolutely. An extremely high ambition to create basically a better world for everybody to live in. Wonderful. So I hope collectively we can achieve at least a great part of that, because ultimately as MSF we would like nothing better than run out of business. We have to be very clear about that, and I think any humanitarian organization should have the same sort of perspective on the future. In an ideal world where governments and civilians take responsibility for each other, there should not be a need for humanitarian action. 99% of the work that we do is responding to the failures of others. So yes, please, create that new world. But don't expect humanitarian organizations to create that new world. And that's maybe a bit of a paradox. But the main thing is that as long as we're not there, and it will probably take a bit of time before we get there to begin with, you still need to have people who are only focused on one thing, which is saving lives, putting people through hardship today. And that action needs to be firmly independent from any other agendas. I'll give you a small example. I was in Greece 3 weeks ago, I think. Yeah, 3 weeks ago. And I visited a number of refugee camps. The last camp I visited, you all know about Idomeni, you know about Lesbos, etc. The last place I visited, I actually hadn't heard anything about it in the media. It's the old airport in Athens, Ellenikon. They built a new airport ahead of the Olympics in 2004, if I'm not mistaken. And part of the old airport had been repurposed into high-level training facilities for Olympic athletes. There were about 4,000 refugees there, with virtually no assistance whatsoever. I went into the sanitary blocks in the hockey stadium, the worst I've ever seen, whereas it would take very little effort to upgrade that. They were built for Olympians to begin with, so the infrastructure is there. And why was there so little assistance? Because these people were Afghans. I'm absolutely sure had they been Syrians, there would have been much more available. Now, why is that important to remark? It's because governments have agendas, of course. We all know that. Even the Norwegian government, which I find one of the few governments that has a relatively pure humanitarian imperative, but of course they have agendas. There's no way you can escape that. And the agendas lately, when it comes to refugees, kind of many problems with the agendas of European states, of course, when it comes to refugees in Europe. But one of the side issues there is also that they're completely tilted towards Syrian refugees. So you create a sort of class A and class B among the people who come in search of safety in Europe. Again, we could only be there because we are an independent and largely independently funded organization, and therefore we can avoid that kind of a bias. So I'll close here for now. My main point that I hope you take home with you is that yes, please let's work on all these issues around sustainability, resilience, community building, peace building, etc., state building as well. But don't co-opt independent humanitarian organizations into that agenda. If anything, we need more independent humanitarian action today than less. We need it in places like Syria, like Yemen, like Afghanistan, Central African Republic, South Sudan, even in the Mediterranean. There needs to be much stronger presence of independent humanitarian action today. Otherwise, we risk sacrificing people today for a bright future tomorrow, and that cannot be the objective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Erwin, for a very clear message there. Our last speaker in this part of the seminar is Cath Silva, representing the Norwegian Refugee Council, a strong Norwegian and global organization. She's head of the NORCAP Partnership and Development Section.
Thank you. Again, it's very nice to be invited, nice to be here together with all of you, to have some time to reflect and think. I think we should do more of that. NRC, Norwegian Refugee Council, we both implement programs, and the department I'm representing today, we work closely also together with UN. We have about 15 partnerships agreement with UN, where we deploy experts, both in terms of gaps filling, but also for strategic purposes. So we're trying in our role to see how we sort of can influence and push the humanitarian agenda in terms of the reforms and a lot of the challenges that UN facing. It's been said a lot of good key messages here today. But I would like to highlight some concerns, some issues from NRC. And I think we have to be better on to build the local capacities and to contribute to strengthening the local system. And this is very important to have a more quality and long-term approach for the response. What we also need to be better on is to not working in silos, to keep more tracks open, like for prepare for prevention and response, and also the early recovery. And of course, also building on the resilience perspective. We would like to see a more stronger political will to prioritize both prevention and resilience, as well as the whole humanitarian response. NRC works with local partners in large parts of Syria, as one example, where we're using both technical capacity and also supporting efforts to respond to the crisis. And this is also giving us ability to access some of the areas which is very hard to access in the country. We also have good examples working together with national stakeholders, like in South Sudan and in Greece. We're working closely together with the Greek authorities, supporting them to set up refugee camps in the refugee crisis we have also in Europe these days. And we're also trying to push the agenda in terms of what just was shared here in terms of catering for all the nationalities, despite if you are from Afghanistan or if you are a Syrian. So that's also part of what we're doing. I just also want to raise that it's a bit of a dilemma or a challenge when seeking route into the humanitarian response in local capacities. As humanitarian actors, we have to be able to work across front lines and to provide services in both associated with the governments, because sometimes that can also put us in a situation that we're not able to have access to the beneficiaries, to the vulnerable populations. Afghanistan is one good example from NRC on that. We should also be better on to have more partnership across, both within development actors and humanitarian actors, and to ensure more longer-term program intervention to find more durable solutions. I think we also need to be more accountable for the people as a people at center approach, making sure that we are accountable for the beneficiaries. We would like to to say our thanks for this excellent report, and we would like to see more independent reports, because as a humanitarian worker, we often make our evaluations, needs assessment ourselves, but it will be good to also have more objective perspectives when we're doing this work. I think that's very much needed. Yeah, and it's a need both for donors and development actors to recognize that it's a space also for the independent humanitarian response, as also highlighted here earlier today. And this is to make sure that we have the humanitarian policy and action in place in terms of humanity and neutrality and so on. So it's a bit like, it's not like one size fits all. We need also to look into the context and what are the opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We don't have a stage big enough for all our speakers today, so I'll ask you to take your seats again and invite Hattrem, Bennett and Sandvik up to the stage again. I think you've provided some similar but also different perspectives, Gry focusing on localization, Tørris on how we are, or Red Cross are actually local and leveraging the capacity. I think MSF Norway pointing to maybe the political impotence to address root causes, and from the Norwegian Refugee Council and reminding us that we must not work in silos. There are other very strong and important voices in this discourse in Norway, and we've invited two organizations who are strong voices, CARE and Caritas, to give some comments, short comments or questions from the floor. So I'll give the word to CARE first. Yes, hi. Lisa, do you need a microphone? Yes.
Focusing in particular on women and girls. So thank you so much for all the really useful and exciting and interesting insights we have been presented with here today from all the speakers and the panel as well. I think we've already raised quite a few of the barriers and challenges that we all face. I think from the World Humanitarian Summit and afterwards there's been a really sort of already increased debate about the issues at stake, and especially around localization, which I think is really, really useful. The numbers you presented at the beginning with the high numbers of people in humanitarian needs responding no to whether they were actually receiving help. I think part of the reason why this is happening is that we still see beneficiaries or recipients as a homogeneous group. We talk a lot about the fact that they are women, men, girls, boys, indigenous people, minorities, people with disabilities. But when you look at the actual design and the actual funding of the humanitarian support, there is very little targeted funding towards reaching the different groups among the populations in need. So my question is more, how would you, from a more to academics, from a more external perspective, what would be your best advice towards the humanitarian actors, the NGOs, to actually change their design to how to reach different, more sort of diverse groups of people in need, moving beyond the rhetorics and moving beyond mainstreaming and actually moving into targeted interventions? And also, this is perhaps more to the Hattrem, to what extent are the donors now willing to listen more to those groups and listen more to local actors, inviting them to the table, inviting them to give you the input you need to fund and support targeted humanitarian action? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Care. We will keep these questions and comments, and you will have the opportunity to respond. But first, I want to give the word to Caritas and their perspectives and challenges.
It is now? Very good. Thank you. I would like to thank all the presenters for very good and interesting presentations and very good reflections. And just see at the title of the seminar, the Humanitarian Point Break. It's also being argued that we're at the breaking point, so to say, as we see that the humanitarian needs are greater than the resources. It was mentioned that only 56% of the needs were met last year in 2015, and as of 2016, only 20% have been met as far. So that is a huge challenge, and we need to do some concrete action how to improve that situation and to bridge that gap in a better way. Much of the discussion today has been in terms of the man-made disasters, and I would like to panelists here to reflect more also on the natural-made disasters and how we approach them differently. Because as the man-made disaster might be more difficult to plan a reaction for, the man-made disasters are quite predictable. We are now seeing which are the areas in the world that are most prone to natural disasters. We more or less know what kind of crisis that will incur and what we need to do to prevent it. But that is not being sufficiently reflected. The World Humanitarian Summit was a great step, was a leap forward. It's the first humanitarian summit, and the outcomes were much better than we feared going into it. I think one of the things that we have been proponents of in Caritas in particular is the localization of aid. And we have been the proponents of a charter for change, trying to also make changes within the NGOs to commit to fund local partners, the local implementing parties in a much greater way, and not to be direct implementing partners, but to use partnerships. We do see some challenges in that. And one of the challenges is also in terms of how the funding is being distributed. It's very difficult for our local organizations. Caritas has 165 national societies, so to say, but very few of them actually access direct funding. They do it through other members of the Caritas family, often located in the western part of the world. And it's really difficult for them to access directly. One thing is in terms of the different donor countries and governments, but as much as it's the problem is within the UN funding. It's very difficult to access the UN funding, be it in regional or in country. So we see now that in terms of lean reporting, Norway has been a big proponent of having a reporting that is meeting the needs of the local actors. We see that the reporting from the UN to Norway is quite lean, but then again the requirements of the UN to the implementing actors are not that lean. So I was wondering in terms for the Norwegian government, how will Norway contribute to meeting the goal of having 25% of the humanitarian funding to come to the local actors, or at least to reduce the transaction cost and give 25% of the funding as directly as possible, as it is stated in the Grand Bargain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the first question from CARE was to researchers, asking you what your advice would be to change the design of our work to make sure that we do targeted interventions. I don't know, Christina, do you want to try to respond to that?
Thank you very much for the question. You know, when we were doing the report and we were looking at some of the ground truth data on, you know, affected populations' perceptions of the aid that we were getting, we had lots of discussions with ground truth on that data, and, you know, to try to get at what that was all about. Was it really that they weren't receiving anything? Was it they were receiving the wrong things? Were they not even aware of what was going on? And a lot of what those answers had to do with was a set of misaligned expectations. And so I would sort of start out by saying that part of the dissatisfaction on the part of affected populations with what we do is about expectations. And this is something I tried to address in my remarks, which is that, you know, humanitarian action was never set up to address the range of problems that are involved in a crisis response. There are short, medium, and long-term problems that are underlying everything that happens in a crisis. And I think, you know, we go in there with our best intentions, but with limited numbers of staff and limited amounts of money. And we pledge to do all that we can to address need. It is impossible to address those levels of need with the funds and the staff that we had. So I think one thing to be able to do is to really set your own expectations as an organization as to what you can do in a crisis setting and what you're going to have to do in a longer term, or with different, you know, with other pots of money, for example. I mean, the second thing that we talked about in the report, but that I didn't address here, is this feeling of destructive competition, that because we have a limited number of donors and a limited number of organizations receiving that money, we're all out there doing everything in every crisis context to be able to attract more and more funding. We're so organizationally insecure because we don't have long-term contracts, because we operate on 6-month, annual, maybe biannual bases in terms of money, that we're always out there doing everything we can, even if it's not in our expertise, in order to attract donor funding. So I think a new model might be to develop comparative advantage, to develop niches. I mean, and I know CARE has actually come a long way in that, in deciding to become focused on women and girls, for example. And, you know, can the rest of NGOs, can international NGOs find a way to work together to their comparative advantage and in complement with one another, so that we're not in a situation where everybody's stumbling all over each other in every crisis context? I think third, I would say, you know, addressing, you know, reaching a more diverse group of recipients. When you sort of manage the expectations as you can, I think helping that would be this idea of engaging local actors, because what they don't bring everything to the table. And I take everybody's point on the panel before that, you know, local response is not always the best response, and you can't rely on local capacity in many types of situations, and you have to, and you can't expect that that local organizations will have the level of scale and expertise that are required in certain types of a response. But having said that, what they do almost always bring to the table is a notion of the context, a notion of the power dynamics, the affiliations, you know, what communities need, what they want, you know, how they're affected differently by different types of crises. So I think engaging with them, at least on the subject of context and relevance, is a first step toward more targeted responses.
Thank you, Christina. We'll also give our speakers on the first row a chance to respond, but first maybe to Kristin, that you, in your intervention, we asked you to focus on the challenges, but to CARE's challenge on advice for solutions. What would you add in addition to what Christina has brought to the table?
I think just one question, which is basically how exactly is this painful readjustment that needs to be done going to play out for you? Not everybody else in the humanitarian sector, but you, and you, and you, and you, right? So what's your plan for shrinking? What's your actual concrete plan for making this happen? Because if we think that this is going to be uncomfortable, it's going to be uncomfortable for not everyone else, but for organizations, right? And we've seen a development where they stop being Norwegian, they internationalize, they regionalize, they localize. But this is going to come at a cost, right? And you know, but a little bit back to the gap. You talked about people who unmet needs, but you know, we know that most people don't sit around for humanitarians to rescue them, right? And we talk about humanitarianism at the breaking point, but that's certainly not the humanitarian sector, because that sector is in pretty robust health. It might be, civilians at the breaking point, but the sector itself certainly isn't, right? So I'm sorry about being a bore, but I want, one thing is to ask the donor to, articulate clear expectations about this 25% transference. But the other thing is, what are you guys going to do? How is this going to look quite practically?
Thank you. Before I give the word to the State Secretary to respond to some very concrete questions, Tørris, you wanted to comment on this from, maybe you can stand up and...
Yeah, just I think what it requires from us in large degree is recognition that as Norwegian cost, we represent transaction cost. And we have to bring in an added value. That added value has to be bigger than the transaction cost that we impose through the system that we have. And I'm not saying we're at the point of succession, but we're very aware of that, and we debate that openly, that we are in a transaction cost, and how do we make sure that our added value to partners like, say, Afghan Red Crescent is then bigger than the transaction cost. And the transparency in terms of transaction cost is not only important towards the back donors like the MFA, it is also important towards the likes of the Afghan Red Crescent, such that they have an idea what is it that we represent as a transaction cost, and that they can come into the fray in terms of how can you provide the field craft that you actually need and make that available and relevant at local level.
Thank you. Tore Hattrem, you said in your intervention that we have to give better, and I think the challenges for both Caritas and CARE alluded to that. How do Norway as a donor give better?
Thank you. Can I just, is it working or yeah? Just to give a very brief sort of meta reflection on the debate here that might be sort of shed some light into my more concrete answer. I mean, when I was laying out my policy, or our policy, our government policy, what you probably felt was that this is something, we based our policy on our experience, our long-term, cooperation with the UN and the organization, on empirical evidence. When we change, it's based on, we have to be convinced empirically that we need to move in that direction. And of course, it's been different. The kind of humanitarian system we're giving now is different from the one that Jan Egeland gave 20 years ago. And what we here see, the present, when you talk about, the systemic crisis when it comes to financial needs, is basically what you could call a democratic liberal model that was designed around the UN, humanitarian principles at the bottom. It's 8 OECD countries finance, most of the world pledges. One has tried to mobilize the Gulf countries and China to, enter into that model. Not very successful so far, which means there are other things, other financial sources are growing. Charities in Saudi Arabia finance local, organizations in the Middle East directly, and which you have spoken about. So we are there, and that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong necessarily with the let's say call it the liberal UN model, which we mainly belong to, but it means that things is changing, and the relevance of the local organizations are much more present today than it were in the 1970s and 80s. The system that we talk about was more dominant, and we're able to provide most of the funds that were needed. We're in a different situation now, and we will adapt. And we've already done that. I mean, there are several mechanisms to ensure that we actually finance local organizations, and that will probably grow slowly in the time ahead, based on experience and facts and evidence. So this is sort of just to sort of give you a taste of that we are always looking to improve ourselves. And I think the question from Caritas was very good. I mean, here you have a well-established institution. We know they are good, and they have local presence all over the world, and they are competing, and we are trying to sort of to make sure that those local organizations who have that ability that you talk about, that they know what's the ground reality are. They might not have a PhD in humanitarian principles, but But overall, you know, it might be effective to use more those organizations because they know the reality on the ground, and maybe we have more effective assistance at the end of the road. So that kind of thinking, we're totally on that. Is that an answer?
Yeah, so what you're saying is actually that Norway is looking to how increasingly be able to...
I'm looking at my colleagues, but my impression is that we gradually have increased our assistance to local organizations over the years. And we will continue doing that, and we note that there is a principle. But of course it will be based on what's working. You know, our objective is to be as effective as possible.
But the soul searching then, so that I hear from Kristin, the challenge to us as organizations, I think that soul searching, both for donors and for organizations, is essential to not only have the academic debate on how to move forward, but actually do the change. Before Christina's final or closing remarks, I want to give the opportunity for our speakers here to also pitch in on the questions, the discussions that are there. Erwin.
Yeah, if you're interested in soul searching, you should come and work for MSF. We spend a lot of time criticizing ourselves. We spend a lot of time being not satisfied with the quality of the assistance that we provide. To give you one example, we very recently finished the biggest ever internal evaluation that we've done. An evaluation to which for which 14 people were hired. It cost about €500,000, and that was an evaluation into our own Ebola response in West Africa. And I think MSF is generally known as having been and admired for having been at the forefront. We're not happy. We think there's a lot we can learn from it. So yeah, in that sense, we do a lot of soul searching. When it comes to connecting with the local communities. Look, if you're like MSF, if at your core you are a rapid response, a rapid intervention organization, then you don't really grow roots in the local communities. But having said that, of course, when we go out with our explos, we try to find the best possible people on the ground who know the situation best, who know how things work, and ideally we hire them as part of our teams. And then when our interventions take shape, typically 90% of our staff, including our medical staff, are from the countries where we work themselves. It's not uncommon to go to a Minister of Health in Africa nowadays and find that at some point during his life he's worked for MSF. So we don't work on those longer term objectives when it comes to sort of upgrading the health capacity in countries where we intervene. But it is actually quite a nice byproduct of the fact that we rely on people who know the countries, who are part of the country, speak the language, know the culture, etc. Very much so. And just one final remark. In many debates on the humanitarian system that I am part of, it always bothers me a lot that half of the time you seem to be talking about funding. Whereas I think funding ultimately is not or should not be the biggest issue that we should be tackling in our discussions. But quite rightly, I think we are in a situation where many organizations find that they have to follow the money trail. Either they choose to or they don't have any other option. So there's an issue there that I think is actually blocking us from sometimes from talking about even more fundamental issues that we should look at.
Thank you, Erwin. I think I can echo the point on soul searching in organizations. Maybe what we lack is to take the consequences of that soul searching and conclude. Yeah. Gry, you had a comment as well.
Is it on? Yeah. Yes, also further to this discussion on working with partners in real partnerships, I think there is also really a role for us as Norwegian NGOs or Scandinavian NGOs who come from societies where this has really been an issue for a long time, and we're used to it, and we have long experiences that we can contribute into these discussions. And there are, cultural differences around the world. It's not everywhere that this civil society focus is as strong as here. And we see it in our own organization, where we see the Scandinavians pushing a lot more for both the partnerships and working with the local actors. So I think we have a role to play here.
Anna-Cath, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think in terms of being, how should I say, efficient and so on, I just want to say that I also echo the the search for more funding and to be there, because we want to sort of, what Kristin was saying, when the earthquake hits Nepal, we want to do everything. And you can see it's also like competition between not only the Norwegian organizations, but also the international organizations. So I would like to see how we can more sort of complement each other and have a, more close collaboration as NGOs and also together with the local partners. I think we have a lot to learn and take it from there.
Thank you. Before I give the word to Christina Bennett for closing remarks, I mean, we have a very competent audience here, and we have a couple of minutes for comments from the audience. If there are anyone who's burning with a comment, a perspective. Yes. We'll on the fourth row first. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Turid Lagreit. I'm currently with the Norwegian Military Academy, but I think I'm speaking here as an ex-OCHA and a Norwegian Refugee Council. And I would like to address some of the issues that I know that Christina and your team, you have been addressing a lot, but you didn't pay a lot of attention to it here. And since we have both OCHA background, the crux of coordination. Because when you say, and I totally agree with that, that focus, we have to turn from what can we provide, so it's kind of us-oriented, it's provision-oriented, to how can we support. I think that is great, but it also, the challenge there is you need even better, or much better, analysis and data. And you need that analysis and data shared as well. And that has been what I have seen in when it comes to coordination, that we have been actually becoming worse. It's a lot of data out there. It's not necessarily relevant. It's very much focused on needs are framed as tons of whatever, or it's really needs are in terms of provision and not in actually what is there, what are the capacities, how can we support those capacities. So how do you see that coming out? Is there any chance of analysis, strategic coordination, and not only technical coordination becoming better? And is that important, or is it really each in one doing things better?
Thank you. Before we have another comment from the audience, the State Secretary have to leave. Thank you for giving very interesting perspective and participating to what is an ongoing discussion where we are looking to find answers together. So we look forward to continued collaboration to find the point break. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Christina and Kristin. All the best. And of course the other members of the
Christina, could I ask you to hold that thought and include it in your concluding remarks? And I'll have one more comment, the last comment from the audience, please.
Thank you very much to all of you. My name is Marit Flod Åkvåg and I work for Save the Children here in Norway. So I think it's from the other panel of the humanitarian, representing the humanitarian organization, I think we heard a lot about both preparedness and resilience being mentioned several times. And so in this discussion about how to give better and support better, I would like the academic point of view, what role and focus you think that resilience and preparedness should have. Thank you.
Thank you, Marit. Resilience and coordination. We have limited time left, so I'll ask you, Christina, to try to sum up and conclude the seminar, and also include, if possible, a first response to these questions.
Sure. A small task. Anything that you wanted to say before we conclude?
No, I'll let you.
Okay. So, you know, this discussion is so emblematic, I think, of the discussions that I've been having with humanitarians over the last 2 years, that, you know, we're all agreed that there is this sense that something isn't working quite right. And actually, I think what excites me is that the World Humanitarian Summit actually managed to, you know, bring some of that thinking to the fore, and to a certain degree bring an alignment as to the recognition of the problem. You know, when I hear people talking about what the problem is, all of you, the speakers, you know, I think we're all looking and talking about the same things. So that makes it, you know, that's a very good start for a change process that needs to come up. I think we're not as aligned and we're not as clear as what to do next. And I think that gets back to the point I was making in my presentation, that these are unanswerable questions, some of them. These will take years, maybe decades to work out. And so we shouldn't also beat ourselves up that we haven't answered these questions. And in this room today, we're not going to get to, you know, to solutions, but we really do need to keep the momentum up of the discussion, or else we'll never get there. So in summing this up and in thinking about what everybody was saying, I think I'd like to divide my conclusion into 2 parts. You know, what are still some of these hard questions that require further exploration and further thought from us, from you, within your organizations? And I think the point was made well by you that, you know, you have to think about this in terms of how these changes affect your organization, your position, your business model, your relationship with your partners, because I think we each have a different role to play, and I think all of these challenges will be different for each of us. So I encourage that. You know, we heard a lot about localization today and in the summit and in the past year and a half about, you know, as local as possible, as international as necessary. It's a very catchy phrase that does kind of sum up the current thinking on this, but what does that mean in practice? How do we improve our analysis of context to be able to make those judgment calls as what is local, what is possible with local, what is necessary, when is it necessary for international actors to respond? I don't think we have the tools yet to be able to make those judgment calls, and we're going to rely on the personalities in the field to make those in the absence of such contextual analysis, which I'm not sure will work every time. We talked about soul searching. You know, as international organizations, what is our added value? How can we reframe what we do from being a transaction cost to adding value to what we hope to be a more localized response? And what does that mean for our field craft? How do we redefine what we do in terms of our own technical expertise that's been developed over decades in order to be able to make that shift? I mean, you made the point about, you know, good doctors that can also teach others. That's a combination that's really hard to find. Can we retool ourselves in order to be able to do that? We also talked, but in saying that, you know, MSF pointed out that we do also need to remain, you know, we do need to maintain a central focus on principled action and in saving lives, because at the end of the day, we as humanitarians will be held accountable and responsible for that, and I think we will feel personal and organizational failure if we're not able to respond in that way in crisis situations. That comes, you know, those are trade-offs and those are hard choices, and how do we make those? Again, I go back to contextual analysis. We talked a lot about the humanitarian development divide, and this is the age-old conversation that's been going on for 25 years about how do we link these agendas. And I think what you were saying and what others were saying is maybe this is the wrong metaphor. Bridging these agendas, you know, suggests that there are 2 separate agendas, that they need to be somehow bridged or merged, and maybe that's not the right way to think about it anymore. Maybe we need to think much more about, you know, working together in complement in crisis settings, and not just sort of a linear transition from relief to development, or a handover from humanitarian actors to development actors. That handover never happens. If you've ever worked in a crisis context, you know that it's a back and forth that goes between short-term and longer-term approaches, that you can never really draw the line of when one ends and one begins. So let's start thinking a little bit more about how we work together in better ways. I think also that in bridging these two agendas, we have to have caveats. I think it was pointed out that, bridging these agendas may compromise what we're trying to do, especially if there are security agendas attached to what some of the longer term priorities are all about. How do we support the SDGs, which I think we would all agree are an important set of targets to be able to approach as a global community. But how do we do that without compromising what we're trying to do, without being co-opted by other agendas, or without being made to do the work of others? How do we let others work with us so that we're all able to work in complement? We talked about principles, and this is a real thorny issue, and I agree. I think the summit was great in the sense that it didn't really question them. It did reinforce them, but I would say that in our research, we found that the principles aren't really that applicable to many actors out there doing response work. And as I asked in my presentation, how do we reconcile that? We want to partner with these organizations. We want to accept their funding. We need their funding. We need to work with local organizations. We've just all talked about that, but how to reconcile our need to maintain those very important principles with working with these other actors. Are we being unethical? Are we not serving the populations that we need to by not partnering with people that don't see the world in the same way we do? But then again, as MSF pointed out, are we being unethical in relying on them in a situation in Lesbos when there are distinctions being made between Class A recipients of aid and Class B recipients of aid, and isn't it our job to make sure that that playing field is evened out? I think there was a recognition that we as humanitarians are part of a larger picture of aid that includes first and foremost and across time politics. Humanitarian assistance is inherently political, and being neutral and impartial in a humanitarian response does not mean being apolitical. It means we need to, we need to decide what our role is in holding governments to account, holding politicians to account for things like IHL, for funding not based on national interest, but based on an impartial assessment of needs. But we also have to engage in the politics and make the politics work for us in our advocacy, in the way that we work with governments. I don't think we can work in this inherently political sphere and claim to be apolitical. Neutral, yes, maybe. Apolitical, I don't think that's an option. Coordination and resilience. So I'm going to get to these and try to answer these. Coordination. We have thought a lot about different coordination models in this kind of new world of enabling versus implementation. And I think, the need for coordination is there. I think we've all seen what happens when a response isn't coordinated, and there are gaps and overlaps and wasted money that could easily have been addressed if there had been more coordination. But I think what we're seeing and what we're sort of playing with right now is, can we see a more devolved form of coordination? So it's not the IASC dictating policy, mounting coordinated response. It's not necessarily the ERC ensuring that coordinated response happens. Can we devolve some of that decision making, some of that judgment, some of that coordination to the regional level, to the local level? Can we form networks of organizations as needed to be able to coordinate a response in the moment that it's required? I don't know. These are things that we're looking at. In terms of resilience and preparedness, yes, both of them very important aspects of a response. I think nobody in this room, I would hope nobody in this room would argue against preparedness. I think we see in both disaster situations and in conflict situations how, preparedness, whether it be, stockpiling of assistance or making sure that there's an insurance scheme in place for a disaster, or whether it's enabling local organizations to really understand what their role might be as first-line responders. Preparedness is key to what is, is a natural hazard, for example, and what becomes a disaster, because they're not, natural hazards or disasters are man-made, I would suggest. They're not. absolved of any sort of human intervention. If you know, I was at the UN during the tsunami response, and you saw how differently that disaster played out in different countries based on their level of preparedness, based on their ability, you know, based on what policies had gone before in terms of the way they had built, you know, built up their coastlines, et cetera. So, and you know, resilience is this word, I think, that's been introduced into the humanitarian lexicon by, you know, donors, by aid organizations who wanted to find a way to make the humanitarian money and skills and time spent in an emergency go further. I actually think that that is the wrong way of thinking about it. I don't think we should be, I think building resilience is important. I'm not sure it's the job of humanitarians to do that. I think what we should be doing is, you know, engaging early on with those organizations and those skill sets and those pots of money that have the potential to be there for the long term, that have the potential to take what we start in a response and lay the foundation for in a response and take that further, not to be doing it ourselves, not to be in protracted crises for decades, because we were never meant to do that. We still aren't resourced to do that. And I think we can properly engage others, and they have to properly engage with us to be able to take that on.
Thank
Sorry, there was one other part, so if I still have time. I know I've just talked a lot. Okay, one last thing was that I wanted to get to some concrete next steps, because I think it's really hard to end these discussions with all of this airy-fairy policy stuff. And, you know, I am constantly challenged on time to let go and other things that I do about, you know, what does this all mean in practice? How can you sit there in London and discuss all of these things when, you know, on the ground it doesn't really work that way? So, you know, I don't have the answers to all of that, and I take everybody's point that it's very hard to put these things into practice. But I do think as next steps, there are a few things we can do as humanitarian organizations that governments can do. I think one of these is to continue the momentum of the World Humanitarian Summit. As I've said a couple of times, it started something, right? Whether or not it's a revolution, whether or not it's turning the system on its head, I have no idea. But it has started a conversation, and let's make sure that that continues. The grand bargain, as the state secretary said, an honest attempt at getting to some of these fundamental reform issues, absolutely. Is it specific? Not at all. So can we put specifics, targets, timelines to the commitments that are in there? Because it is all, you know, headed in the right direction, but let's make it happen. On UN reform, that is my bugbear. I think a lot, as I was saying earlier, I think a lot of these problems require a rethink of how the system that was built in 1945 needs to be more relevant for the system today. The QCPR, which is a UN process for sort of the development sector, is one place to start in terms of taking some of these ideas for reform and putting them through the intergovernmental process, which will be important. The Security Council, reform of the Security Council, I think is a really hard one, a hard nut to crack, and I'm not sure I should call for that in something like this. I'm not sure how many decades it will take to get there, but I do think there are things like the veto and suspension of the veto in cases of mass atrocities. There are some interesting ideas out there, and we should be pushing for that. That's how we engage with the politics. And I think we also need to hold the next Secretary General to account for this change agenda. I think I was in the last session of that World Humanitarian Summit waiting for the blueprint. Like, what are we going to do next? What does this all mean? How are we going to take this forward? And I think, you know, it's coming. I think, as the State Secretary said, it's coming in September. So let's hold that, the next Secretary General who starts, you know, next year, let's hold that person to account for pushing that change agenda, for establishing a change agenda, for establishing champions. People, you know, Norway, for example, an excellent, you know, champion already for these types of issues. You know, how do we champion the change agenda going forward? And I will end it there.
Thank you, Christina Bennett, for a very impressive conclusion. An impressive conclusion of what is a very comprehensive discussion, what has been a very comprehensive seminar. Thank you so much to all our speakers who have contributed. Thank you to the audience in the room and those who have followed the streaming of this seminar. And I just want to let us go out of this seminar with the challenge from Christina Bennett on seizing this momentum and not throwing it away, but really hold ourselves to account to really make a change. Thank you all for participating.